Welcome, and it's good to be back. I've advertised this talk as one that will examine both Native American and Black histories vis-a-vis U.S. culture. But in my research, I've had to separate the two. Not because they're entirely different, they're not, but because of the sheer amount of history distinctive to each. So I'm going to focus on Black history, and it's an uncomfortable topic. Messing with the racist trauma in this nation triggers all kinds of reactions, from fight, flight, freeze, denial, anger, and helplessness, and sometimes open and responsible conversation. Black Lives Matter actions recently inspired me to speak like this today. Where does this topic take you? Let's start off with President Bill Clinton apologizing to the Black male victims and their descendants of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, when the United States government gave Black men syphilis on purpose to test human subjects what the disease does to the body. It was a secret experiment 40 years old when it was discovered and closed down in 1972.
What was done cannot be undone, but we can end the silence. We can stop turning our heads away. We can look at you in the eye and finally say, on behalf of the American people, what the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry.
Preparing for this has not been easy. It is not my usual thinking, but that's the point. The usual white thinking has gotten into this fix. Usual is the consciousness of racial hierarchy inscribed into our national myths, laws, economy, and culture. As Einstein said, the consciousness that created a problem is never the consciousness required to solve the problem. The murder of Mr. Floyd and so many other Black men and women has defined our times perhaps as much as a pandemic. Maybe, finally, America knows it has a grave inequality problem. This disruptive, revolutionary moment is a result of a partitioned, apartheid, and a partial view of humanity that enables some to thrive so easily and some to die so needlessly, while inequality can exist without race. The American brand of inequality comes interlaced with race. I live in a divided world that my ancestors created, the hallmark of which is an economic game of extreme winners and extreme losers, with a politics that fogs and mystifies this reality, and supported by a culture not invested in confronting hard truths about who we have become. Things are horribly wrong, but the culture of white supremacy shapes whites' experiences such that I may still operate in blissful ignorance about what is wrong. Racism is the culture of our United States, the water in which whiteness swims. Most of the time I do not practice the critical reflection upon my culture and water, for they operate Wizard of Oz-like, and I'm usually quite satisfied not to see what happens behind the curtain. This takes a kind of courage for which most of us are not trained. Have I the courage to examine how we got here? I'm one voice, and a non-Black one. While I'm trying very hard, I may get some things wrong. On reparations, there is no consensus. The current white consensus is that there is nothing wrong. Or if there is, we can just tinker with a few screws and bolts and somehow make some minor mid-course corrections. This Band-Aid approach, though, will never tell us how to stop doing harm. Before I can do good, I must first stop doing harm. What is this harm? Here's the root of it all. A year before the Mayflower, on August 20th, 1619, the White Lion landed at what is now Hampton Roads, Virginia, with 20 or so Angolans. The White Lion, a privateer vessel, had recently attacked and stolen these Angolans from a slave ship that they had kidnapped from Angola. So twice stolen, terrorized by long and interrupted journeys, 20 Africans landed on the Virginia shore. We know only a couple of their names. No law existed to prohibit what was to become of them, enslaved for life, and their children as well, and their children, and on, enabling an incompatible culture of free whites and enslaved African descended to develop. That culture hardened into customs and values, outlining what blacks and whites could and could not do, which led to laws like Virginia's 1661 law permitting any free person to own slaves, which hardened white people's views of Africans and blacks into a fictional race that was different from, and perhaps even dangerous for, white culture, which reinforced customs and habits, which led to strengthened laws, which led to the American character, which led to our current destiny. This is the way that Americans button up our shirts. Things started off in 1619 so terribly wrong, and so few of us venture back and go back and try to see what it means to rebutton things. Meanwhile, enslaved labor builds early American colonies and the U.S. Republic. Free labor. Edward Baptiste's book, The Half That's Never Been Told, explains what a mighty economic tailwind that enslaved labor gave the United States. Cotton became a world cash crop, leading to laws regulating enslavement, such that the economic and legal and cultural arrangements of slavery were never questioned. From the Three-Fifths Compromise in the Constitution to postponement after postponement of ending the slave trade, to the Missouri Compromise, to fugitive slave laws, to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, all victories for a continued, enhanced slave industrial complex that was ignored by most politicians, never addressed by white churches, and justified by Enlightenment philosophies. Whites have built wealth from black free labor. White prosperity today is linked with the enslaved labor of the ancestors of the 44 million black Americans today. Meanwhile, blacks were sold and bought to pay debts, to buy land, to save famous universities, perhaps yours. White culture made enslavement and enslavers God-given things, and they reinterpreted the Bible to defend it. It was said that black people do not feel pain like whites do, really don't internalize traumatic culture or torture, haven't the intelligence to be human. Depicted as aliens, blacks' best place was in servitude, in chains, always less than, always separate. The takeaway: any economist can tell you the unbelievable boon such labor was. Without it, the U.S. would never have achieved its meteoric economic rise. My own net worth is tied up with that. Chew with me on that for just a few moments. The Civil War could have started us on a permanent fix, but the post-Reconstruction period had whites reinstitute a kind of re-enslavement of blacks, who became, with freedom, unable to own land, to vote, or to live where they wanted with good jobs. You're free now. Oh, good luck. Slavery by another name. Jim Crow laws enforced this racial segregation. White-dominated state and local legal bodies in the late 19th and 20th centuries disenfranchised and rolled back any gains made by blacks during Reconstruction. The KKK and the Southern sharecropping culture ensured blacks were ever and always reminded of their status through lynching, rape, segregation, language, Jim Crow, over-policing, hyper-incarceration, even criminalizing behaviors like not having a job. These are all the American terrorist tactics my ancestors used to keep blacks in their place. The civil rights movement of the 60s brought some relief, but not a permanent fix. Its progress in voting is slowly being dismantled today, with states tightening their voting laws, helped by the Supreme Court. America remains divided. Blacks and whites experience daily life so differently. An example from my classroom every semester. I ask my students on the first day of class about the content, the current content of the talk they receive from their parents. I call first on white students who, to a person, always talk about their parents teaching them about sex and birth control. Then I call on the black students to speak about how to talk about the talk. And they always talk about their parents pulling them to the side, often more than once, about what to do when, not if, the police pull them over, how to act in white culture, what to do with your hands, voice modulation, the entire body language presentation, in order to stay alive. The talk signals to us with ears to hear that there are two Americas, one trying to stay in power and white, and one black trying to stay alive. You see, you don't have to do anything wrong as a black person in 2020 to die at the hands of a white person or police or someone standing their ground. You could be jogging or walking around with your hands in your pocket. You could be driving while black or asleep while black and still get killed. Shopping while black brings unbelievable scrutiny. Life in this low-grade terror for millions is the day-to-day norm. After the Civil War to 1960, 6,500 black Americans were lynched, an average of 2 per week. But since 2015, nearly 5 black people per week have been killed by law enforcers. Across this country, blacks are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police than whites. So you can see some benefits of being incidentally white in America and the deficits of being incidentally black here. You may quibble with my arguments with statistics on black violence, or you can say all lives matter, but have we listened yet? Have we seen? Have we considered the almost hourly wager of showing up black in America, a danger produced by white culture and habits of thinking? Can you imagine being constantly reminded every minute of every day in public of one's second-class standing, and then, if you get angry about it, getting called out on your anger as if it's unproductive, all because of luck of the draw skin pigmentation? The cost of black experience. Blacks are 4 times as likely as whites to die from COVID-19. With their early warning radar systems always at high alert in public, blacks have higher rates of hypertension and diabetes, more likely than not to have cancer screenings, and thus have the highest mortality rate for cancer, less likely to have health insurance, which leads to all kinds of delays of health maintenance and interventions, less stable food supplies. Black infant mortality is twice that of whites. Maternal mortality is 4 times whites. Black neighborhoods are more likely to have food deserts. There's a 30-point percentage difference in home ownership between blacks and whites. And yet that's getting larger, not smaller. Not owning a home means less credit, and that more expensive, not meaning fewer chances for low-interest loans. And low-interest loans are the fuel in our capitalist economy. More than 50% of white households have a FICO credit score of above 700, compared with only 21% black households. It is expensive to be black, especially if you start out with 0 capital. Now, what does not owning a house really mean in the United States? If you've tuned out my recent statistics, please listen to this one. The Washington Post, the Brookings Institution, and the Pew Research Center all agree the average white family's median net worth today is about $175,000. This is what a family can pass on to the younger generation, or use as a second mortgage, use for retirement, use for intergenerational transfers, offload risk in pandemic times, invest, reduce health costs, educate kids, and use as a cushion in today's uncertain world. It enables a better credit rating, making it cheaper to be richer. A family that owns a home enables its children to replicate its lifestyle in the next generation. Wealth is a safety net. Black families' median net worth is 1/10 of this, or $17,500. This is not accidental. It is still impossible for black people to create and accumulate intergenerational wealth, which, much more than income, has profoundly handicapped black lives, health, jobs, education, and housing. Being black means more poverty. For every dollar a white family holds, a black family has 10 cents. Do I hear a moral argument to change things with a different consciousness than the one that just created it? Just one insight into how this happened. From 1868 to 1934, the United States government gave away 246 million 160-acre parcels, nearly 10% of the nation's land area, and they gave them to white families. Today, the wealth from this land is in the legacy of some 46 million American white adults today. This did not happen overnight. It's been incremental, little by little. We have all preached that we're equal. But at the very starting line in 1619, our white ancestors hobbled our black ancestors and kept on finding new and very efficient ways to cripple and new ways to blame blacks for limping. So enough history. What to do? Can we as a nation, as people of goodwill, postpone confronting the difficult issue of reparations? Courts in U.S. criminal codes, law codes, already practice reparations toward the aggrieved from the transgressor. But with the passage of time, as generations of blacks supplant each other, the issue of reparations has not gone away. We have never made an honest and fair assessment of history. Unpaid slave labor built the American economy, creating vast wealth that blacks are still barred from sharing. Is this not something to acknowledge as a moral requirement for being a true citizen today? The United States has practiced reparations before. People of Japanese descent forced into internment camps during World War II received $20,000 in 1988 and a formal apology. The United States still pays victims of the 40-year secret Tuskegee syphilis experiment. Of the 37 states that practice eugenics sterilization, only North Carolina has paid out about $50,000 each to the 177 living victims. But these are small potatoes. Contrast Germany, that has invested $7 billion in reparation payments to Holocaust victims, education programs, museums, and measures to back up its promise of never again. To this day, the only Americans who have ever received government restitution for slavery were the white enslavers in Washington, D.C. in 1862, who were aggrieved over losing their enslaved property. So what will reparations mean for us? Two things. First, an educated apology that involves a public reckoning of the terror our American experiment has visited upon black citizens for 401 years. Can we seek forgiveness and confess complicity and blindness in our cultural and legal treatment of blacks? Can we proceed to a common future without this forgiveness? So, Mark, how much are we talking about? It's hard to calculate the full economic debt of slavery and Jim Crow. I have only incomplete estimates. But Larry Neal at the University of Illinois figured out that lost wages alone between 1620 and 1840 added up to just over $2 trillion of today's dollars. Other economists calculated that labor discrimination between 1929 and 1969 cost black workers an additional $2.5 trillion. Ignoring interest, that's about $5 trillion right there. Divide that amount by 44 million black Americans, and that's nearly 70,000 for every black man, woman, and child in the United States. Just saying, though, in 2020, our government has passed so far $2.2 trillion in stimulus packages. We spend over $750 billion every year on the military. But are we anywhere close to saying never again? The United States has yet to compensate, atone, or address descendants of enslaved black Americans for their labor. Slavery, Jim Crow, anti-black practices like redlining, and discriminatory criminal justice and education have robbed blacks of the opportunities to build wealth afforded to their white peers. Indeed, our government functions as an imperious enabler of white privilege. Our sitting president incites race hatred and lights racial fires with white supremacist-laced accelerants. Is our government capable of knowing its foot still chokes the breath out of blacks? Sadly, we may not be able to rely upon the government to do the right thing, which means we have to initiate what we must with what we have and the time we share. It's up to folks with moral imaginations and courage to lead. Our unexamined history is not worth repeating. Without confession, truth-telling, restitution, reconciliation, the hungry ghost of our ancestors will continue to haunt us. Black lives will continue not to matter as much as other lives, and shall be lives separate and unequal. White people will limp morally as much as blacks limp economically. So who are we going to be? We are limited only by our imagination. Comparing votes with dollars, we can vote with our $20 to bring about a new world. We can Google black-owned businesses in our area and frequent them first. We can befriend a recent black college graduate and pay her or his college loans for a year or more. You or this congregation can partner with the United Negro College Fund. This congregation can start a friendship with a black congregation in a friendship of equals. We can investigate redlining here, fight gentrification here. It won't be easy. This is a sea change. In our repair of 401 years of inequality, it is probable that whites will lose health or wealth, risk status, undermine their own security. Seems to me the nearest approach to justice for blacks for the past is to do justice with blacks in the present. Black people have called out racism for generations. They have said it calmly, shouted it in the streets, put it in writing, put it into music, in movies, shows, stages, art. We have danced and laughed and clapped, but have we yet to hear? Centuries of slavery and decades of Jim Crow still keep us artificially divided. Chocolate and vanilla, based on myths presented as true. How different would we be without these beliefs? Racism is real, but is it a true way to live? What does the conversation dedicated to truth look like? There's never a bad time to do what's morally right. We can no longer address this historic inequality on the cheap. Freeing ourselves of pervasive poverty, unequal education, and separation is expensive. It will prove difficult to change, but we need more, much more white skin in the game. Can we afford it? Well, maybe we should ask, can we afford not to? Martin Luther King, Jr. has our last word.
In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt.
Thank you. There are 2 slides coming up. A list of resources follow, and a slide of discussion questions, both of which you can pause on your device and consider. Thank you.